Hey, Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk specifically about climate change. In previous videos, we've talked about CO2 concentrations, we've talked about what happens to both plants and animals on their efforts to cycle carbon, and now we're going to talk about kind of what do these greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, or nitrogen oxide compounds, how those contribute to the changes we're experiencing on the planet right now. So, grab your notes, dive in, and here we go. The first thing that we kind of need to describe a little bit is why we have climate change in the first place. And really the biggest reason or the biggest thing that contributes to global warming and our climate change that we're experiencing is the fact that we have on our planet an atmosphere. That's no new, that's not a new piece of information. We've known about our atmosphere for a long time, but if we just kind of compare the average temperature on or found on Earth to the average temperature maybe found on something that is similarly distanced to the sun or from the sun as we are, which would be our own moon. We know that our moon has no atmosphere, and it is roughly the same distance from the sun that we are. And so when we compare these two objects in space at roughly the same distance, we can see that there is a huge temperature difference, which is fundamental or vital to life as we know it. And so there is really no great way of getting or calculating the average surface temperature on the moon. And so I'm leaving a question mark because, it wouldn't really tell us anything. There are huge fluctuations in the temperature found on the moon. It ranges from roughly negative 150 degrees Celsius on the dark side of the moon all the way to a positive 120 degrees Celsius, which, if you kind of think about, is well above boiling. So you go from an area that is touching the sunlight or receiving sunlight and it's boiling or overboiling to the dark side, or in a crater that doesn't have the sun exposure, and it's going to be substantially below zero. So you could do the middle or the mean between the fluctuations, but again, that really wouldn't tell you much. So we on the planet have an average surface temperature of roughly 14 degrees Celsius. Now we do have fluctuations which are extreme for temperatures that we can withstand, and in Antarctica at the the coldest area, it's probably in the negative 80 degrees Celsius, which again is only about half of what the moon experiences. And the hottest part would be basically 50 degrees C, which is a positive 50 degrees Celsius, and that would be in Africa, right around the equator, northern Africa, Sahara Desert, stuff like that. Okay. What allows an object like the Earth to see much smaller fluctuations and maintain an average surface temp that is conducive to life would be the atmosphere. Okay, and you can obviously see what would happen if the Earth didn't have an atmosphere. We would essentially not be able to sustain life. The Earth would not be conducive to life, and luckily for us, it is. So we know that the Earth has as an atmosphere, and that atmosphere works like a greenhouse works. And so in order for us to kind of fully understand that, we need to talk about how a greenhouse works. Greenhouses are really, really beneficial to the growing of plants year-round, and that is because even in cold climates or even in the cooler months, it still allows for a temperature that is really conducive to really efficient photosynthetic rates. And so the way that it works is the sun emits radiation, and that light and radiation is going to come to Earth in a really, really tight, short wavelength. And whether we're talking about a greenhouse or we're talking about the Earth's atmosphere, this really tight wavelength or really short wavelength is going to be more energetic, and therefore is going to be able to actually bypass or pass through, in this case, the glass of the greenhouse, or in case of the Earth's atmosphere, it's going to actually penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and continue on until it actually strikes the ground. Since we're just talking about how a greenhouse works, we're going to focus on that. And then on the next slide, we'll actually kind of articulate how this phenomenon still works on the Earth. So specifically talking greenhouse, the short, really intense short wavelength is going to penetrate the glass, which is what the greenhouse is constructed from. It's going to strike an object, in this case the ground. It could be the plants, it could be the soil, it could be the pots, it could be whatever. Anything inside the greenhouse, the short wavelengths are going to actually strike that object and is going to do kind of two things. One, it's going to physically heat up those objects, and you will see that these yellow arrows are basically just heat. Warmed air is going to rise and is going to heat the greenhouse. That is what is actually increasing the temperature inside the greenhouse. These objects, like the soil, the plants, the ground, the pots, all of those things are going to collect the really short wavelength light, and it's going to heat up. And because it's warm, it's going to actually radiate the heat. Heat's going to rise, the warm air is going to rise, and it's going to physically heat up the space. Greenhouses work because they maintain a really warm internal condition or a really warm internal environment, even if the weather outside is really cold. Some of the radiation that is going to strike the ground isn't going to be absorbed, it's actually going to bounce off, but in the process of bouncing off, it's going to switch from being really intense short wavelengths to less energetic longer wavelengths. Because we produce longer wavelengths which are less energetic, some of that is going to actually be able to penetrate the glass and is going to re-radiate back into the atmosphere. For the purposes of the greenhouse, that energy is now gone. Okay, so it has left. We cannot use it anymore. Some of this really short or some of this really long wavelength, lower energy stuff is actually going to bounce off and is going to be trapped by the glass. It's not going to be able to penetrate, and it's going to re-radiate back down, again further warming the structures on the inside of the greenhouse. So because we are warming the structures inside and we are keeping some of this energy trapped, it is going to overall cause the internal temperature to rise, even if it is very cold on the outside. Okay, it keeps the plants growing, it keeps photosynthesis steaming along, it keeps the enzymes associated with the plants at optimal temperature, and we are able to grow plants year-round, like I said, even in colder environments. The same phenomenon, the greenhouse effect, the same phenomenon happens in a cold environment when your car is parked in direct sunlight or on pavement. A lot of times when you get in, it is not cold on the inside of the car. In fact, it's really warm and pleasant. Okay, it can be very cold on the outside, but will be warm in the car, and that's because the short wavelength light will penetrate the car windows, will get trapped on the inside, and will heat up the dashboard and heat up the seats and heat up all of the trim, and that will radiate heat into the interior cab of the car. So how does this actually kind of apply to an Earth situation? It's the exact same phenomenon. The sun is going to send really intense short wavelength light. It's going to penetrate the atmosphere. It's going to strike objects on the inside of the atmosphere, specifically in the on the planet. Some of that energy is going to be lost to space. Okay, this again is energy. Some of it will be lost, but some of it is going to actually bounce off and get stuck, bounce off and get stuck, bounce off and get stuck. And it's all of this energy that gets trapped is going to actually increase the temperature on the inside of our atmosphere, which is going to keep our temperature on the planet or within the planet's atmosphere conducive to life. What actually creates the atmosphere and keeps this heat trapped? It is called greenhouse gases. Okay, greenhouse gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxide compounds, helium, all of these things are said to be greenhouse gases and can actually help to trap the energy to maintain Earth's temperature. Okay, works just like a greenhouse, which is why we call it the greenhouse effect. Okay, if I erase that out of there, methane and nitrogen oxides also contribute to Earth's greenhouse effect, but to a lesser extent. We're going to talk about why that is the case in a later slide, but for now, water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, all of those are greenhouse effects, or greenhouse gases. However, carbon dioxide is kind of the most interesting one, or kind of the one that economists and environmentalists and stuff are worried about the most. So what makes up our atmosphere? We have roughly 1% of the atmosphere made up by a variety of what we consider to be greenhouse gases. Now, carbon dioxide is a big one. It's a big buzzword. A lot of people know about carbon dioxide. A lot of people are talking about carbon dioxide being the biggest contributor to global warming. But you can see it makes up really a very, very small percentage of our atmosphere. However, carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing, and because it is a greenhouse gas, it is contributing to global warming. So some other greenhouse gases that we're going to kind of need to keep an eye on would be water vapor. Not a huge deal because it is kind of constantly entering the atmosphere, but is also kind of constantly leaving the atmosphere as part of the water cycle. Carbon dioxide is a big one, methane's a big one, nitrogen oxide is a big one. However, all of those, like I said, contribute to roughly less than 1% of our atmosphere. Biggest contributors to our atmosphere, obviously nitrogen is a big one, oxygen is a big one, and then everything else is roughly 1% or less. When we talk greenhouse gases, the two that kind of come to mind in a lot of cases are carbon dioxide and methane, and I've provided a couple of items or a couple pieces of information about each of these molecules. Methane obviously is CH4, CO2 or carbon dioxide is CO2, and so the molecule and the molecular structure is different. We don't need to key in on exactly like why it's structured the way it is, or what is, what it's compositionally made of. But carbon dioxide is really, really high in abundance. And one thing that I would like to kind of preface this slide by saying, there's really two things or three things that we need to talk about in terms of what makes a greenhouse gas really effective at increasing the temperature of the planet. One of them is the abundance. Basically, how abundant is it? You will see that carbon dioxide is very high. It is roughly 400 parts per million by volume, whereas the abundance of methane is very low. It's roughly 1,700 parts per billion. We know that million is obviously a smaller number than billion by a substantial amount. And so if we're talking parts per billion to parts per million, this has a much higher abundance, so it is way more highly concentrated than methane. Another one is persistence. Okay, how persistent in the atmosphere it is, meaning how long does it stay. Methane has a relatively low or small or short lifespan, roughly 12 years in the atmosphere, whereas carbon dioxide literally lives for about 50 to 200 years. Now, I use the term lives loosely because we know that carbon dioxide and methane are not actually alive. They're just molecules, but we're still calling them lifespan. It's basically how long that molecule of CO2 or that molecule of methane persists in the atmosphere. So we have abundance and persistence, and then we also have ability to absorb long wave radiation. Now, CO2 has a very low ability to absorb long wave radiation, whereas methane has a very high ability to absorb long wave radiation, roughly 33 times higher than CO2. So those three stars, abundance, persistence, and the ability to absorb the long wave radiation, makes these two molecules kind of interesting and why they are both considered to be greenhouse gases. Now, when we think about kind of summarizing, there are two kind of summary statements we can come up with. Carbon dioxide is the bigger issue when we're talking about greenhouse gases and its contribution to global warming, and that is because although methane has a higher a much higher ability to absorb long wave radiation and re-radiate that energy back into the environment, it also is much less concentrated, roughly 200 times less concentrated than carbon dioxide. Specifically, if I restate that, carbon dioxide is 200 times more concentrated than methane, and it stays in the atmosphere for way longer. So even though methane warms better, carbon dioxide is way more highly concentrated, and it persists in the environment way longer. and so carbon dioxide is the bigger issue, which is why carbon dioxide is kind of the buzzword and is also synonymous with global warming. Okay, methane is an issue, but carbon dioxide is the bigger issue. There are two main factors, like I said, that determine how much of an influence a gas will have on the greenhouse effect. That is the ability of the gas to absorb long-wave radiation and re-radiate that energy, and the concentration of that gas in the atmosphere. We've already said that H2O, or water vapor, is a greenhouse gas. We know that CH4, or methane, is a greenhouse gas, and we know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas as well. They all have the ability to absorb long-wave radiation and re-radiate that energy back out in all directions, which contributes to the warming that we see globally. But we also know from that last slide that CO2 is much more abundant and it persists way longer in the environment than both H2O and methane does. Again, CO2 is the bigger issue. H2O and CH4, obviously big issues, but not as big as carbon dioxide. How the greenhouse effect works, again, we've already kind of gone through this, but in order to summarize and wrap up the greenhouse effect, these are the steps. 1, approximately 25% of solar radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere, meaning that this really, really short-term wave, really energetic radiation is going to be emitted from the sun. It's going to penetrate our atmosphere and strike the Earth. Some of it is going to be released to the atmosphere or released to space, but some of it is going to be trapped. Approximately 70% of solar radiation penetrates the atmosphere and reaches the Earth's surface. The surface of the Earth absorbs the short-wave solar energy and re-emits at longer wavelengths. Again, it's going to come in really intense short-wave, and it's going to be re-emitted as longer wavelength. That longer wavelength, okay, up to 85% of that long-wave radiation is going to be re-emitted as heat because it's going to be trapped or kind of absorbed by the greenhouse gases, which are all these CO2 molecules and water vapor molecules that are literally making up the atmosphere. When all of those molecules absorb these long wave radiation waves, they're going to heat up and re-emit that heat in all directions. That's what contributes to the warming. And heat passes back to the surface of the Earth, causing warming. The more CO2 we have in our atmosphere, and the more methane, and the more water vapor, and the more nitrogen oxide compounds, the more molecules we have to actually trap and absorb that long wave radiation, which is going to increase our warming because more molecules absorbing more energy is going to re-radiate more heat, causing a bigger warming effect. So, evidence, correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and average global temperatures. You will see that this graph is showing you two things. It's showing you the temperature in black, and it's showing you concentration of CO2 in parts per million in blue. As our CO2 concentration increases, so does our average temperature. There is a very strong correlation between atmospheric CO2 concentrations and average global temperature. They literally follow the exact same trend line. Okay? Now, in red, let me erase this. Okay, in red, I have highlighted the section of data that goes from about 1951 back to, in this case, 1880. All of that is going to be ice core data. We're going to talk about ice core data in a minute. Everything post 1951 is going to be actual Mauna Loa CO2 concentration measurements that are taken from the air. Okay, why is ice core data important? Because we can actually we can actually kind of measure the atmospheric CO2 concentration and the average temperature going back several 100,000 years, which obviously we don't have that data from actual atmospheric readouts, but we can look back in time using the ice core data. So how are ice cores used? Ice cores are basically cores of ice that were or have been drilled in Antarctic ice sheets, and we use them to deduce historic carbon dioxide concentrations. You can see that when you actually look at an ice core, It is made up of these kind of annual rings, much like what a tree would look like if you were to look at tree rings. We know that tree rings kind of demonstrate or show or depict the annual growth that a tree exhibits or a tree experiences annually. These layers in this ice sheet are basically deposited annually, and because they are deposited annually and basically covered with snow and then creating ice, they have little atmospheric air bubbles that are trapped in every single layer. And so in a lab we can extract the air bubbles from each of these layers, and we can look at the actual CO2 and oxygen isotope values, and that gives us an understanding of what the CO2 concentrations were and what the temperature was at that particular point in time. So the core shows annual layers, which contains bubbles trapped in the ice. These air bubbles contain samples of carbon dioxide concentrations as well as oxygen isotopes, like I just said, providing insight into what the atmosphere and climate was like a long time ago. And like I said, we can look back at this point in time several 100,000 years. I believe we can go back to roughly 400,000 years. And when you do that, and you look at just ice core data, because we have not been, if you look at this, actually measuring atmospheric CO2 and temperature values this far back. Okay, so we can literally look back 400,000 years, and we can see that when we look at the actual temperature in red, and we look at the actual carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million, again, there is a very strong correlation. When CO2 values go up, so does temperature, and when temp goes down, so does CO2 levels. They fluctuate almost perfectly, and if you laid these two lines right on top of each other, they would essentially have the exact same trend. Ice core data, like I said, roughly 400,000 years. Most fluctuations in CO2 concentration are correlated with the temperature rise or fall, and again, that is very directly correlated. So how have humans impacted the atmospheric CO2 levels? Again, we can see that since 1850, our atmospheric CO2 concentrations have been increasing. We can see that in blue. We can also see that the actual kind of temperature fluctuations are following our atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, but there's kind of 2 points in which we need to keep track of. Here is the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, we know from history class that the Industrial Revolution basically kind of more widespread increased our manufacturing capabilities, increased our technological capabilities, and really made increased emissions possible. However, in 1950, there was a huge increase in fossil fuel usage, and if you look at these two, there's a pretty slow growth, or really kind of shallow slope here. There's a much steeper slope here. Okay, is there a correlation between increased fossil fuel usage and an increased rate of CO2 production? I think there is. Again, that's up for you to decide. Okay, here is kind of a shift in the slope. It goes very slow to very rapid since the kind of widespread usage of fossil fuels. So, bringing all this together, what does it all mean? Increased global greenhouse gases, or greenhouse gas concentrations, will likely cause a variety of atmospheric problems. We're going to obviously, because of global warming, have higher average temperatures. We're going to have more frequent and intense heat waves. It's going to increase droughts in certain areas of the planet. It's going to increase the rainfall and flooding in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. We're going to have more frequent and powerful tropical storms. We've actually seen that in the last 10 years. We're going to have, or potentially have, changes in ocean currents because of an unequal distribution of heat. Okay, different heat distributions are going to cause ocean currents to change. Wind patterns can change. Ocean acidification is currently happening, and then because of ocean acidification, there has been and will continually be a loss of aquatic biodiversity, but there could also, because of these other things like droughts and storms, have an actual increased loss of biodiversity in terrestrial ecosystems as well. Why is greenhouse gases, or why are the greenhouse gases and global warmings a threat to coral reefs? Okay, we don't typically think of aquatic ecosystems like ocean ecosystems to be as affected by atmospheric temperatures because they're in water. Water kind of absorbs a lot of energy and doesn't actually change. It's a lot more stable of an environment than terrestrial environments are. But the threat to coral reefs is real, and this is why. The organisms that build the coral reefs are very, very sensitive to these conditions. Okay, water temperature has to be perfect. There needs to be an ideal water temp. If water temp gets too warm or too cold, the organisms that are sensitive to temperature cannot survive, and if they don't survive, then coral reefs are not built. Water acidity is a big one, water salinity is a big one, and water depth is a big one. Okay? Increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the air, so atmospheric CO2 increases, lead to an increase in dissolved CO2 in our oceans. And when we dissolve CO2, as I will show you in a future slide, the CO2 kind of dissolves into water, it associates with the water molecules and creates acidic conditions. And so as CO2 increases, it's going to lower the pH of the water, which means we're going to increase acidity. And that's going to, because the organisms are very sensitive to acidity, it's going to cause death to coral polyps and other algae that are important when we are actually creating or needing to maintain and create the coral reefs. When coral reefs die, the organisms that depend on the reef are forced to move and seek food and shelter elsewhere, and we call this ocean acidification and coral reef bleaching. Okay? The reason it is called coral reef bleaching is because the corals, which are supposed to be very multicolored and healthy looking, actually get bleached and appear to be just white, which are obviously unhealthy. So what is ocean acidification? This graph is going to show a couple of different things. We obviously have in this kind of purpley color atmospheric CO2 concentrations. In my last video, we talked about why there are annual fluctuations in our CO2 concentrations, and that's because in the northern hemisphere, during the winter when photosynthesis isn't happening, we're going to have a peak in our CO2 concentration. Then obviously the reverse is going to happen in the summer when photosynthesis is happening. And so these small fluctuations are going to be kind of annual fluctuations, but the overall trend is that atmospheric CO2 concentrations are increasing. That's actually being followed by a seawater dissolved CO2 concentration is increasing. Those basically are parallel with each other. So as CO2 concentration atmospherically increases, so does the dissolved atmosphere, or the dissolved CO2 concentration in our ocean. And then as dissolved CO2 concentration increases, the ocean pH is dropping. Now I know when we look at this pH scale, it is not a huge drop, okay? It's only a drop in like, I don't know, maybe 0.3%. But a 0.1 pH unit drop represents roughly 30% increase in ocean acidification, and that's because the pH scale is a logarithmic scale, and so small actual pH unit drops can actually be huge percentage drops. And I don't know about you, but I think a 30% change in anything, both atmospherically or aquatically, is a huge deal. Some or current climatologists estimate that by the year 2100, which could be potentially in our lifetime, ocean water could experience further decrease of 0.5 pH, which, like I said, because it is a logarithmic scale, is going to denote a 150% change in acidity. That is substantial, and it might be possible for aquatic organisms to withstand a 30% change. It is, in my opinion, not going to be possible for aquatic organisms to withstand a 150% change. That could be, substantial problems and can definitely impact aquatic biodiversity. So, kind of wrapping it all up, how does ocean acidification work? Atmospheric CO2 is going to be dissolved into the ocean. And so as the atmospheric CO2 increases, so does the dissolved CO2 concentrations. We already know that happens. We've been measuring that last graph, depicted that. As atmospheric CO2 increases, so does absorbed or dissolved CO2 in our oceans. When CO2 and water mix together, it produces carbonate ions, and it actually produces bicarbonate ions. The carbonate ions are the most important part when we talk about the organisms that require calcium carbonate. These are all of the organisms that actually need to build shells. Marine calcifying species, like things that have exoskeletons or calcium carbonate shells like clams, mussels, crabs, stuff like that. They require carbonate ions. They use the calcium bicarbonate to actually build their exoskeleton. Increased CO2 actually kind of takes those carbonate ions out of the water and it forms them into bicarbonate. Bicarbonate forms carbonic acid. And when bicarbonate or carbonic acid is produced, H+ ions are released into the water as well. And we know from our previous lectures that H+ ions released into a solution is actually like the definition of an acid. And so it's these H+ ions that are being kind of put into our environment or put into our solution. This is what increases acidity and therefore decreases pH. Carbonate ions are not very stable or soluble in water and are being converted into bicarbonate. It's decreasing the concentration of bicarbonate, which, like I said, is the calcium carbonate that these marine calcifying organisms require to build healthy shells. And if they are supposed to be building healthy shells and the water is being more acidic or is becoming more acidic, their shells are actually kind of being degraded and are being dissolved, and that obviously is not conducive to life and is killing them, and so they are unable to make the corals like we need them to make. Okay? Shelled organisms are often keystone species, meaning the entire food web is at risk. That is important because not only are they building the coral reefs, which are going to harbor a lot of the food items of all of the aquatic ecosystems, they're also a place of shelter and it's essentially the marine organism's habitat. And so if you cannot make their habitat, the habitat is being deconstructed, it's being eliminated. A lot of these food webs are at risk of collapse. So we've talked about a lot. We talked about it relatively quickly. We talked about carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor, and all of those greenhouse gases and how they contribute to global warming. We've talked about data that supports climate change. We've talked about ocean acidification, which is what happens when our CO2 levels atmospherically are increasing. Okay, hopefully you learned something. Bring your questions to class. I'll see you later.